What is peace? Now, most would say that peace is an absence of violence, and they're not wrong. We say that a nation that is not at war is at peace. But an absence of violence or conflict does not define peace. You can have a peaceful country where people live in fear or oppression, where people are not free to live full lives. True peace is when people are able to live full and free lives. Today is the first Sunday of the season of Lent, and for this season I put together a sermon series that I've entitled A Week of Holy Terror. Because if we look at the events of, because we're going to look at the events of Holy Week, that time between Palm Sunday and Easter. And in those 7 or 8 days, we find a lot of stories that we know, but that I don't get to preach on because they're all encompassed in one small span of time. And these stories include the cleansing of the temple, the Last Supper, Jesus' arrest and 2 trials, the denial by Peter, his praying in the garden, his crucifixion and resurrection, all powerful stories that are very important to our faith. And the events of this week, that week leading up to Easter, they are nothing short of horrific. And so I've titled this series A Week of Holy Terror because of the sheer brutality that Jesus endured in this week. He was seized, he was violently assaulted, he was subjected to a sham trial, not once but twice. He was betrayed by his closest companions and condemned by the very people he came to save. He suffered torture and ultimately execution. It was a week marked with unimaginable terror. Although Holy Week begins on Palm Sunday with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, I'm going to hold that story back until our actual celebration of Palm Sunday. And so today, I want to look at another event, the event we call the cleansing of the temple. And this story takes place on Monday of Holy Week. We call it Holy Monday, the day right after Palm Sunday. Because if you recall from the Palm Sunday story, Jesus and his disciples arrive in Jerusalem with the great throngs of pilgrims coming to celebrate the Passover. They enter into Jerusalem and then immediately turn around and head back to Bethany to spend the night. The next morning, they do return to Jerusalem, and this is when they enter the temple grounds. Now, the temple that stood in Jerusalem in Jesus' day was, in fact, the second temple. The first temple had been constructed by King Solomon around the year 1000 BC. That temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. The second temple was built around 500 BC, and we can read of its construction in the book of Nehemiah. Then, 35 years before Jesus' birth, that second temple underwent a massive renovation during the reign of King Herod. This was a pet project of his, and he spared no expense on this project. He doubled the size of the Temple Mount. He rebuilt or replaced nearly every part of the temple, including the massive foundation stones, which still stand today. The temple renovation was indeed one of the larger construction projects of the time. And it was a huge hit with the people. The temple became the center of religion and government in Jerusalem. People came from all over to admire the massive marble and the gold complex. The central building of the temple, there was a central building which stood on the Temple Mount, was divided. It was a shoebox-shaped structure, and half was the court of the priest. And that's where you had the Holy of Holies, the altar to God. Only the priests were allowed to go into the altar, and only priests were allowed in that half of the building. The other half of the building was divided in two. One was the court of men, which was the room closest to the court of the priests, and then behind that was, of course, the court of women. Only women were allowed there. The men could go further in. And then outside this building, but within the surrounding walls of the temple campus, was an area known as the Court of the Gentiles. And this is where the non-Jews were allowed to come to worship and pray. Yes, there were people who were drawn to the faith of the Jews who had not been born Jewish. When Jesus taught in the temple, he taught in the court of the Gentiles. Now, on this morning of Holy Week, Jesus and his disciples enter into the temple complex. And once they are there in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, Jesus begins to do something that we find uncharacteristic of him. He goes to where merchants are selling items and exchanging currency, and he pushes over their tables. And then he drives these merchants, as well as people who are purchasing, out of the court and out of the temple complex. And in addition, he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Jesus justifies these actions with words from Scripture. He quotes the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah asking, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." So what is going on here? What compels our usually gentle Jesus to resort to this level of violence? And the answer is that for Jesus, the sole purpose of the temple should be worship. Worshiping our God. That and no more. And it certainly shouldn't be a place of commerce. The temple was a destination for all Jews as well as Jewish pilgrims. Jews would travel from hundreds and thousands of miles to worship in this grand structure. And their worship included animal sacrifices and monetary contributions to the temple. Now, if you're a pilgrim and you're traveling from far away, say another country, would you rather travel and carry your own sacrificial doves or sheep, or would you rather just buy them in Jerusalem? I mean, yes, it would be much easier just to buy these items there at the temple. There were merchants in Jerusalem who offered these animals for sale. And as an added convenience, they had already been pre-blessed by the priest. Furthermore, there were also those pilgrims who desired to make their monetary offerings to the temple. However, the only allowable currency for these offerings was a Jewish shekel. So if you came from another country, say Egypt, it's unlikely that you would have any shekels in your pocket. Money changers were present for the necessary currency exchange, and of course, they provided this service for a fee. Although the animal sellers and the money changers had always been present in Jerusalem, it was only under the administration of the current high priest Caiaphas that they had been allowed to operate on the temple grounds there in the court of the Gentiles. And the court of the Gentiles was the place where non-Jews would come to pray. And remember, Jesus cites those words of Isaiah saying, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." And that for all nations is important because the house of God is open to all, Jews and Gentiles, to all those who desire to worship there. Jesus not only objects to the crass commercialization taking place there on the temple complex, but also he is upset at the fact that what is going on is disruptive for the worship of the Gentile people. Because the Gentiles, according to Isaiah, have the God-given right to worship. And they should be able to worship in peace just as the Jews were. So, think of it this way. Have you all seen the Girl Scouts out selling cookies, around town? Yeah? Have you bought your Thin Mints yet? Okay. So imagine this. Imagine that a Girl Scout troop sets up a table, let's say, back there by the door, and they're selling cookies there. They've got the approval of the session to do this. And out front, on the corner, are more Girl Scouts waving signs that say, "Buy cookies here." And they do it all day, including during Sunday worship time. So during our time of worship, we've got strangers walking in and out buying cookies. They try to be quiet. They try to be respectful, but it is still disruptive to our worship time. Well, that's what's going on in the court of Gentiles. But the Gentiles do not have the leverage with the temple authorities to effect change. It's even been suggested that the temple authorities were receiving kickbacks from these sales. Jesus, in essence, is not just objecting to the profit-taking that's taking place in God's house. He is also standing up for those Gentiles, protecting their right to worship in peace. And then there's another part of this story that often gets lost in the hubbub. And that is the line, Jesus would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. What does that mean? Well, it goes back to a Jewish law that prohibited people from carrying personal items into the temple. In other words, the temple isn't meant to be a shortcut from A to B. You can't just walk through it because it's convenient for you. Also, you're not to go shopping and then bring your bags into worship. The purpose of the temple is to be a destination with a singular purpose, the worship of God. It's not to be part of your to-do list for the day, because anything else you do is a distraction. You are to come with the singular focus of worshiping God, not getting the oil changed in your car and stopping by the bakery for cupcakes. Just one thing. When the chief priests and scribes get word of what Jesus has done there in the temple, we read that they then begin looking for ways to kill him. Why would they want to kill him? Well, for one thing, he had broken the law. He had disturbed the peace in their temple. So just for fun, I looked into the Tennessee Code about disturbing the peace. And according to the 2024 Tennessee Code, Title 39, criminal offenses under Section 3917-305, Jesus could have been charged with disturbing the peace if he, quote, committed an offense in a public place with intent to cause public annoyance or alarm. Well, I would say he's guilty of that. That was his intent, to create public annoyance or alarm there in the temple. And according to the statute, the Tennessee statute, which really has no jurisdiction in Jerusalem, of course, he commits two offenses. First, he, quote, engages in violent or threatening behavior, which he did. He was violent and threatening, pushing those people out of the temple. And second, he creates a hazardous or physically offensive condition by any act that serves no legitimate purpose. Yes, he was physically offensive. Again, pushing people out, turning over tables for no legitimate purpose. Yes, he had his own purpose. He was making a point here, but that was not an official purpose. But you know what? It does not appear that it was his actions in the temple that disturbed the temple authorities. Because the gospel reports that the chief priests and scribes, who are the temple authorities, were afraid of Jesus, not because of his turning over the tables, but because the people, the crowds, were spellbound by his teaching. And this is where we find one of the reasons for Jesus' execution, and there will be more. The temple administration fears Jesus because the people listen to him. And by their logic, if they are listening to Jesus, then the scribes and the priests are afraid that he's not listening to them, that their own power and influence must be decreasing as people pay attention to Jesus. And they don't like that. They are threatened by that. That upsets their peace. So why does Jesus decide to disturb the peace like that? Because that's what he's called to do, to challenge the status quo, to raise the hard questions, to point a spotlight on injustice and inequality in this world so that all may see it, so that nothing can hide under a veneer of peace when there is no peace. And that should be our charge as well. Again, to point a spotlight on injustice and inequality in this world, to overturn every stone, looking for those people who've been mistreated, forgotten, or ignored, those people who've been oppressed. So as we enter into this season of Lent, let us recommit to be Christ followers, and let us disturb the peace. Let us disrupt the peace of this world so that it may be replaced with the peace of God. Amen.